And good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Lived Black Experience weekly broadcast where we bring you sometimes difficult topics, but I like to, no matter how difficult, call these topics edutainment, where we like to educate, inform, and enlighten you on what the lived Black experience is all about. First of all, happy St. Patrick's Day, and I'm excited about that. I'm here in Savannah, Georgia, where it is always the largest celebration um, in the nation, and so even in COVID. Um, Without a formal celebration, people from all over the world are here in Savannah. This is also Women's History Month, and that's what makes this topic this evening extra special. As a matter of fact, this entire month of March, we will bring topics to you about women and our power, and our privilege and our achievements and accomplishments. And so this evening, we're bringing a very interesting story about a woman in Louisiana who actually owned slaves. And there is a greater story about women who were slave owners. It's not an uncommon story that women had their own wealth and had their own slaves. So we're very excited to have a guest all the way from New Orleans that has always had interesting stories um, from that area. How are you, Sister Khara?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good, good, good. Well, thank you for being here. This is Sister Khara House. I like to say our resident facilitator. And good evening, everyone. And we encourage you to ask your questions. Um, Nothing is off board. We do this to inform and to educate and enlighten, so we want you to ask questions, and we certainly expect that you will have questions for our guest this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Sister Khara, take it away.
Well, good evening, everyone. And as Ms. Bernadine said, thank you all for joining us this evening. It is my pleasure to introduce our topic, which is They Were Her Slaves, the story of Madame Delphine LaLaurie, a Southern belle. And also my privilege to introduce our speaker, Mr. Malik B. Bartholomew. Malik Bartholomew is a seventh generation New Orleans native who serves as a community griot, cultural curator, local historian, photographer, researcher, and tour guide. He is a proud graduate of John F. Kennedy Senior High School and Dillard University, where he received his Bachelor of Arts degree in history. Post-graduation, he has since spent countless hours in many of the city's archives, exploring and learning more about the unique traditions and history of the city of New Orleans. Recently, Malik has launched the NOLA show, a new social media-based talk show currently on Instagram every Thursday at 6 p.m. The show is designed to spotlight the unique and hardworking people that make New Orleans the special place that it is today. And you can go to www.nonolatours.com for additional information. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Bartholomew, and welcome.
Hello. Hey, Miss House, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Welcome to the presentation. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much.
I'm going
Thank
to
you
pull
so
up
much.
your slides.
No problem. Thank you so much for the organizers, the producers, and everyone who had a hand in putting together this great platform to inform and equip and spread knowledge about Black history and Black subjects. My name is Malik Bartholomew. I'm the owner of No Tours, which is a Black based tour company here in New Orleans. I kind of renamed my presentation. It's a story of Marie Delphine LaLaurie, and the Africans whose names and stories we do not know, but we must tell. I want to dedicate this presentation to the Africans who unfortunately either lost their life or who were hurt or traumatized by Madame Lorry and people such as her. And I want to dedicate this presentation to them. I guess we can move on to the first slide. So the first slide, when we get there, is a brief timeline of the history of New Orleans. I guess I can wait. Next slide, please. Ms. House. Trying to make sure to see it. Thank you so much, Ms. House.
I'm just trying to make sure it's advancing. Is it moving for you?
It moved. It just didn't get as well. I guess that's the biggest it can get before it is not taking up the portrait screen, but it didn't move to the next slide. So I do see it. So it's a brief timeline on the history of New Orleans. New Orleans is a very special city. It was founded in 1718 by the French on the curve of the Mississippi River. It was designed to be a port city, and it was at the location of an old indigenous or Indian trading ground. The first Africans to arrive in New Orleans was in 1719. These Africans were kidnapped and forcibly brought to the Louisiana colony in New Orleans to assist the colony in the production of rice. And according to scholar Gwendolyn Mildo Hall, who wrote Africans in Colonial Louisiana, these Africans brought the necessary skills and trades in order to not only save the colony, but to make it a sustainable place to live and thrive. By 1722, the capital of Louisiana for the French was moved from Mobile to the city of New Orleans. In 1724, the Code Noir was passed. The Code Noir was the French black codes that were used to regulate African life in the French Quarter and in Louisiana. Some of the laws of the code is that all Africans had to be baptized into Catholicism. You also have in the Code Noir saying that black people and white people should not marry. You also have regulations of what you do with runaways, which actually, according to the law, they should be branded in their face or their shoulder with the fleur de lis, and their ears cropped, which means cut off. The Code Noir also gave edict that direct people who own Africans should not actually punish them, that it was a job of the state to incur punishment on Africans, and that all masters must feed their Africans and etc. Now we know that some of these laws were not followed, and that some people were brutalized as well as mistreated. New Orleans and Louisiana has a very unique history where we was French from 1699 all the way into 1762 when France ceded Louisiana to Spain. So this, when it was a Spanish territory, this is where our person that we're going to talk about would have lived a bulk of her life. New Orleans was actually destroyed in 1788 by a great fire. It would be destroyed again in 1794 by a great fire. Also during the Spanish control of Louisiana, and that in 1791 it would start the Haitian Revolution, which has a direct impact on the city of New Orleans. In 1803, France sells. Let me back up. In 1802, Spain returned Louisiana to France, and in 1803, the United States of America purchased the colony of Louisiana, not the state, but the colony that we now know as Louisiana Purchase to the United States. By 1812, Louisiana is going to become a certified state of the United States. But in 1811, Louisiana has the largest known slave revolt in American history, miles away from the city of New Orleans. Next slide, please. So as we move to the next slide, please, that we're talking about the person in context of who we're going to talk about, which is Marie Delphine LaLaurie. Her family actually arrives from Louisiana, from France. Bartholomew McCarthy. They are actually, today is St. Patrick's Day, and Delphine is actually of French-Irish descent. Her grandfather was an Irishman who goes to France and then migrates to French Louisiana. They arrived in New Orleans by 1730, and he would have a son named Chevalier Louis Bartholomew de McCarthy, who is going to marry a widow, and she would give birth to 3 children, 2 boys and 1 daughter, and one of those daughters would be a girl in 1775, Marie Delphine McCarthy LaLaurie. Marie Delphine McCarthy was born into a very wealthy New Orleans Creole family. She is definitely, as I was researching, the epitome of French Creole royalty. Also, she is definitely, her family is very well connected. They own several properties. They own, of course, New Orleans was considered to be a metropolitan and port city, and people would have major plantations outside of the city. Her family owned their own villa or plantation away from the city, where she would have been spending her time. She was trained and educated, which was very uncommon for girls at that time. Also, it was noted that she was extremely, extremely beautiful. In documents or accounts, I came across people about descriptions of how beautiful she was. In 1800, on June 11, she actually marries a Spanish official, Don Ramon Lopez, who is coming to be an attendant for Spain. He marries her on June 11th, and then he is recalled back to Spain. He's called back to Spain because he was not given permission by the king to get married. He was supposed to, as a member of the court, was supposed to get permission from the king of Spain to get married. And then while he's in Spain with his new wife, Spain gives Louisiana back to France, and then Louisiana is sold to France, to the United States. So in 1803, he finally gets pardoned from his crimes, and he's actually granted a position to the city of back to the city of New Orleans from Spain. As he's en route to go back to Spain, he actually dies. He dies en route in Havana, Cuba, not knowing that his wife is pregnant, and she gives birth as following him in Cuba, and then returns back to New Orleans by 1804. Next slide. So Delphine is now a widow, and she has 1 child. She is still very wealthy and very well connected in the New Orleans scene, but she's still very young and she's still very beautiful. And she gets married to a French man, and not a Spanish man, but she gets married to a French man named John Blanc. John is a recent arrival from France. John is a very interesting character because he's a little bit of everything. He's a statesman. He is a swindler. He knows how to finagle financial contracts and etc. And he has business dealing with pirates in his area. He's a very, very interesting figure, but him and Delphine gets married, and they buy a residence on 409 Royal Street. Royal Street, for those people, is in the French Quarter and is actually parallel to Bourbon Street. So Bourbon Street is Royal Street is the next big street over from Royal Street. They also own a villa or a farm or a plantation outside of the city, and this union produces 4 children. So Delphine at this point has 5 children. Because of her being married to a businessman, she entertains in her home. She's a very hospitable and etc. And we learned that in 1818, John Blank, he either dies or disappears. There is no real documentation on him dying or what he died of. And this is very, 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 it's very odd that an important statesman and businessman dies in a very hush manner. So I don't know what's up with that. Maybe it has something to do with Delphine. But in official documents, business documents, she is called the Widow Blanc, which pops up in official New Orleans records. And this happens in 1818. In 1819, Delphine is in court and she's petitioning to free an enslaved man named John Lewis, or Gene Lewis. When I going through the documents and researching, I was like, well, why she's in court petitioning for John Lewis? She's petitioning for John Lewis' freedom because this is a request from her deceased husband, John. John, her husband, wants this man which they describe him as a man in his 50s. So I'm assuming that this is probably one of the first people that he buys when he comes to Louisiana, and he probably promised this man freedom upon his death. So she's in court seeking the freedom of an enslaved man named John Lewis. Also, if you notice in my presentation, you will see the word enslave. I do not like using the word slaves. Slave takes away a person's humanity. The Africans who were brought here from Africa, from the different nations of Africa, the different countries of Africa, these are people that came from cultures and nation states and who had rich heritage and skills. So I honor them by always calling them the enslaved and not simply just the slaves. I restore back humanity to these people. In 1825, a man named Louis Nicolas Lorry arrives from France. He is a mediocre medical student. He earned a degree in dentistry, but when he gets to Louisiana, he's going to practice medicine, meaning physical medicine of healing people. I was very concerned about that, but I learned that in this time era, people who got medical degrees did that. So if you went to school for dentistry, you can go to you can practice in something else. So it was very, very common. In 1828, Delphine marries Louis Nicolas Lorry. She's also older than him, so he's a younger man. And in 1828, their son John Lewis is born. So I was like, hold up. He arrives in 1825. In 1828, they're married. I was like, something's up with this. And then I realized Marie Delphine was pregnant, that she was already pregnant and she was with child. And actually, when I looked over the baptismal records, it shows that this boy, Jean Louis Lorry, was baptized in St. Louis Cathedral, and 5 months later, Delphine is married to Lenore. So yes, she was married. She was pregnant before she got married for her 3rd marriage. So this is her 3rd marriage. Delphine is actually the breadwinner in this marriage. She has her own money. She has her own property, and she also owned enslaved people. Delphine purchased a mansion at 1140 Rue Royale or Royal Street in New Orleans in the French Quarter. It's a beautiful new 2-story Creole style building. It has a courtyard, balcony so that the breeze in. And it's in this building that Delphine is going to be known as a socialite. She's going to host parties and dinners. But it's also in this home that rumors and whispers are going to start in the New Orleans community about Delphine and how she treats her Africans. We can go to the next slide. So as you move into Delphine LaLaurie before the fire, it's interesting to note that she's going to pay for this home and this matching by herself. She's not going to actually use her husband's money. They're married in 1828, but by 1832, Delphine is going to petition a court for an official separation from her husband, citing that his behavior and that they could not get along and etc. Also, she's going to be in court that same year petitioning for the freedom of an African that she owns by the name of the Venice. And she's going to petition for this African. And also she's going to give a loan to a free woman of color named Sarah Lee. Now, I don't know if this woman, Sarah Lee, is she baking pies or cookies, but according to the court documents, this African woman, free woman of color, is named Sarah Lee, and Delphine gives her a loan. Now, one of the things I want to impress on you was going through the documents, I learned that Delphine's father, as well as some of her uncles, had Black mistresses or wives. In the earlier years during Louisiana, especially in New Orleans and around the New Orleans area, it was a very male concentrated area. It was a very male concentrated where there was very limited amount of women. And when African women arrived, white men, because they did not want to marry white women that was in a lower class than them, so they actually developed relationships with Black women, some forcefully through assault, and some through coercion or impression on them. However, this culturally made a culture in New Orleans where it was commonplace for white men to have Black women or Black wives. Even if they had a white wife, they would have wives that they would keep in the back of the French Quarter or in neighboring neighborhoods like Treme or in Marigny. It was interesting to note that her father had a very known Black mistress or Black wife, which we know this because the family actually sues this woman to get property after his death, and she wins that lawsuit where this Black woman keeps her property, and her uncle is known to have Black women as well. In the 1830s, rumor starts to appear because people are starting to talk about the appearance of her enslaved Africans, that they look thin, that their skin don't look right. Knowing that New Orleans is a poor city, the type of enslavement in the city of New Orleans was very different than other places in the South. One is because the influence of the Cour Noire and the alleged legal rights that the Cour Noire gave Africans as it pertained to treatment. The other thing is because New Orleans is a poor city, Africans have always had navigation around New Orleans, meaning the Africans would go to the river to get water every morning. They will go to the market to make groceries for their master. They will go to the carpenter. Pretty much they are walking and roaming around the French Quarter to handle business. Also, because of the Cour Noire, on Sundays is a free day for all Africans, and they are technically allowed legally all the way up until the Americans get there, and then after the Americans, culturally, to have the day off from work on Sundays. So for the town people not to see her Africans around would have been a red flag for them. But they talk about how these Africans, when they do appear in public, how they look. A lawyer was actually sent to the house to remind Lorry, Delphine, to what is the requirements of keeping up your Africans. And the lawyer who went around the house reported that he did not see any evidence of wrongdoing or mistreatment. A year later in 1833, there's an incident that was stated or recorded that there was an enslaved girl who fell from the roof of her house, a roof from the mansion of Lorry Mansion. It was said that she was being beaten and chased by Lorry because she snagged a piece of her hair while brushing her hair, and Lorry, in rage, ran with a whip to beat the child, and the child fell or was pushed off the roof of the house. This caused more stirrings where, in fact, there was an investigation and a court attempted to take the Africans away from Lorry. However, a family member brought the Africans, paid for the Africans, and brought them back to Lorry house. So this is a lot of information. Now, it was also said that between 1830 and 1834, that allegedly 12 Africans died at the mansion, including a woman named Bonnie and her 4 children, Juliet, Florence, Jules, and Lynette. So this was adding that these people and her Africans weren't being seen, and they were dying by her hands. We can move to the next slide. So as we move to the next slide, I'm sorry, can we please have the next slide? We have the fire. In 1834, on April the 10th, a fire breaks out in a Lorry mansion. Now, as y'all, almost every great city, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, has suffered from these great fires. And also, as y'all noted, that in the French Quarter, it was burned down in 1788 and 1794 by 2 great fires. So when fires broke out in the city, the town people responded. They were able to break into the home, and they discover an elderly enslaved woman that was chained to the stove. She admitted that she was the reason behind the fire, that she really could not take the suffering anymore, that she wanted to pretty much die. The town people started, as the fire spread, because there is no technical fire department. These are volunteers and etc. So they're probably going to get waters and stuff, and there's still fires raging. They encounter Lorry, who attempts to tell the people to rescue the finery and the artwork and the silverware and etc. And the town people ask about rescuing the enslaved property that they know Lorry owns. She tries to hush them down about their requests. They're told that there are Africans in the upper apartment of the house. When the town people get up into the upper level of the house, they notice that the room is locked. The judge, who actually has come down to the fire scene, asks Lorry to procure the keys. She denies requests for the keys. And then, because they hear moans and cries behind the door, it was decided to break down the door, and that's when they discovered a very, very ghastly sight. Now, y'all have any kids or anybody in the room, please, because it get kind of graphic. So just in case y'all have kids or anybody in the room, the New Orleans Bee and several New Orleans papers extremely documented what was reporting what they saw. They saw elite 7 enslaved or more or less horribly mutilated, suspended from their necks with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. And that was in the New Orleans Bee in the April 11, 1834. They saw people chained on different stages in the wall. They saw people in cages with spikes and hooks, whether if they went to sleep, they were gouging themselves. They saw people mutilated that were cut up, different body parts, eyes gouged out, etc. They saw people whose bones had been broken and were allowed to heal in unnatural positions. A man was said to have a hole drilled through his skull, and he had actually a spoon. He had a spoon in his skull that it was said was to stir his brains. There was another man who was covered in honey and was filled with black ants and cockroaches. A woman whose skin was peeled off her body in to make her look like a caterpillar. Another woman allegedly whose mouth was filled with feces and her lips were sewn together. And one of the most extreme acts that I heard about was a woman whose bones was broken in such a way that she moved about like a crab. These are just some of the stories of the horror that the town people saw when they broke through the doors and attempted to rescue the Africans who was in this upper compartment. We can move to the next slide. Delphine life after the fire was it was stated that her coachman came to get her for her evening ride, and they put her in the coach, and she was able to escape out of the city, making her way to the back of the city of New Orleans to Lake Pontchartrain, where there was a boat waiting for her to take her across the lake to Mandeville. They said from Mandeville she went to Mobile, and from Mobile, after a couple of days, she was sent to New York, where she caught a boat back to Europe, and then eventually she arrives in Paris. Dr. Lorry, her husband, finds his way out of the home, and he gets to Cuba, where eventually he dies in Cuba. Her two daughters that lived with her actually stayed in the city, and her youngest son actually is going to be sent back to Paris from family members in New Orleans. When she arrived in Paris, she tried to reassert herself into high society, but when the people of Paris learned who she was from New Orleans, she was shunned from high society. There are letters and archives written from her youngest son talking about the behavior of his mother, saying that she kind of had some type of cognitive dissonance about what happened. Like she couldn't really recall the night of the fire and why people in New Orleans was mad at her. She wanted to return back to New Orleans. Also, there is a case where, when I told you about Sarah Lee, we know about Sarah Lee because when she's in Paris, she sued Sarah Lee in Louisiana to return her money back to her. So clearly she was tight for money, and she sued this free woman of color sometime I believe in the 1850s, and she won the lawsuit. There's just really no speculation of how or what she did when she lived in Paris. And then there's even speculation of how she died. Some people say that she was actually gouged by a boar in a hunt in France. There was other speculation that she died on December the 7th, 1849 in Paris, and her body was exhumed in 1851 and returned back to New Orleans in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. There was also some legends that say that she came back to New Orleans, which because how infamous she was, how well noticed she was, I don't see her sneaking back to New Orleans. But they say that she actually faked her death in Paris so she could return back to New Orleans. But I don't see her actually returning back to the city of New Orleans after that incident. So we can go to the next slide about the Royal Street mansion. You probably can't see because there's a lot of different things. And I just wanted to give you an idea of what happened. After that, the town people went crazy. They literally demolished her home. They looted it. They tore out the walls and etc. The police had to come and restore order, and they probably were stationed there for a couple of days. The police allegedly of the time, and this is more myth, I guess, because I didn't come across any factual reports, but it was said that the police actually heard scratching and moaning and etc. Allegedly, years later, that when they tore up floorboards underneath the house, they say that they found dead bones of dead bodies underneath the house, and some people believe that the moans and cries that the police heard was people that she buried alive underneath the house before she escaped to Paris. It's so crazy and odd that when she escaped to Paris, however, well, let me not go to that first. I will go to the Africans who were in the who were rescued, were brought to the prison. Some of them died, 2 or 3 died, I believe, almost immediately after being moved. But the next day it's recorded that over 4,000 New Orleanians went to go see them as if they were a circus act, that they literally put them on public display, and they were, some people were saying that they had to see it for themselves, but it still shows you the inhumanity or the ill-treatment of Black people. Also, Marie Laurie's family handled the business of her estate after she left. They actually are documents of them selling the home, and then from them proceeding selling the home, they also sold her Africans that she owned. I would have thought that they would have at least been confiscated by the states, but there were 11 Africans that was sold um, um, in her estate through her family member. So it just shows you just how inhumane the treatment was during that era and during that time. But the house has been everything from a furniture store, from a bar. Also, after the Civil War, it was attempted in the 1870s. The house was actually made a public high school for girls. And when the White League, or when there's a surge of white violence, taking back the South, actually men go into this public high school and physically remove Black girls from the high school, because at the time during Reconstruction, all the schools in New Orleans was integrated, so they literally removed and physically ejected the Black girls from this high school. A couple of years later, it's going to be a Black girl high school, but it was only a Black girl high school for 1 year. Most things that happen in this space only last a year or a couple of months. All people found signs of cries, moans, screams, paranoia activity, and increasing the legends and the stories that the house was haunted. Sometime in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the home was divided into apartments. In that time area, the French Quarter had developed into being an Italian ghetto. The Italians are the last major European immigrant group to migrate to New Orleans, and they used to call the French Quarter Little Sicily. These Italians lived in those apartments, and they reported all type of weird activities, all type of noises, sounds, and etc. The house is going to be eventually, by the 1950s, the 1960s, a New Orleans physician, a retired physician, is going to buy the house. He's going to restore it back to what he thinks is the original footprint of the house. However, he's going to die. And actually, it's from 1970 to 2000 when he owns the house. Of course, the house survives Hurricane Katrina, and in 2007, actor Nicolas Cage bought the house, but he's going to lose the house because of taxes two years later in 2009. If you go to the house today, it is a private residence. I don't know who owns the house or who lives in the house. Even though I pass there at least once a month or more times than that. But I guess they want to keep it quiet of who actually lives in this house. But it's still a very eerie feeling when you're standing in front of the house. It's definitely a lot of energy when you're by the house. And Madame Lorry is said to still haunt the house and etc. So she was a woman who lived. There's a lot of questions because, of course, she was not brought to trial. So we never got the full story. However, even with the facts that we do have, we do know that she fled the scene. We do know that the third floor was locked up. We do know that they found Africans in the upper stair components mutilated. Some people have tried to pin the actions on her young husband, who was a doctor, saying that he was doing medical experiments. But if he was the problem, why did she flee? Why didn't she stay? Why didn't she clear her name, becoming from a old New Orleans family that was well connected and white? So there's very, very questionable activities on why she did not. That points this at her. Also, this was her house. It was not her husband's house. And he actually, when she filed for separation, he was not living in the house, even though it's documented that he was in the house at the time of the fire. It still points that either both of them or one of them was doing these horrific and satanic activities to these people. I guess I can leave with that. I definitely want to honor those Africans who were victims of her insanity. So I hope y'all learned something new or different on this house. And yeah.
Yeah, that was very interesting to say the least, I think. Her story is one that is so uh, I want to say peculiar and alarming in many ways, but also I think one of the first questions that we want to come to for our question and answer
Okay.
is talking about the fact that she was a white female slave owner,
Right.
or owner of enslaved Africans. And so, if we can talk briefly about that, because I think so often we have that perception that slave owners were white,
Right.
or were white males. And there's something different in this knowledge of a woman like this, who not only owned African slaves, or enslaved people, but also did these things to those people that she owned. So,
Right.
what does that tell us about the nature of slavery in New Orleans, and just the culture that that revolved around that, and to our perceptions of what slavery was?
Right. I think that's a very great question. I think you cannot kill someone else without killing yourself. You can't enslave someone and not enslave yourself. Um, for too long, people have focused history and the problem of enslavement or white supremacy on white men only, when white women were active participants in maintaining as well as implementing black violence on black people and black bodies, um, all throughout the South. You know, it doesn't get talked about. In Virginia, there was a law that was passed in the 1600s, the casual killing law, where they was talking about how you cannot you cannot bring somebody up for charges who were trying to implement discipline on their Africans, and by way they killed them. And a lot of people think that it was about black men, about white men, but it was really about white women killing. Think about your husband bringing a bastard child into your home. So think about these women and how they treated those children, burning them, whipping them, beating them, and sometimes killing them. So white women, even to this day, if you look at the poll numbers of who voted for Donald Trump, um, white women have been hand in hand and complicit with violence, with maintaining white supremacy. However, they have been quote unquote shilling with the whole "I'm weak, I'm fragile, I'm a Bella, I'm a," mentality, when they were very active participants. Now, New Orleans is a little bit different because New Orleans operated under the Napoleonic law. So women in general could own property in the Louisiana and New Orleans. So you have women like Lorry. You have another woman in Natchitoches Parish, El Concon, Marie Concon, who's a black woman who have children with a white man and a black man, and she owns African people as well. So you have that going on in Louisiana, where women have the right to own property, which is for like literally in colonial Louisiana, women are owning property before women are owning property in Virginia, Georgia, and etc. So on that subject, the last thing I'll say is there are researchers who are talking about this. There's a book called "They Were Her Property," white women as slave owners in the American South. So it's talking about the history of white women owning black people and black bodies, and also punishing and doing cruel things to those bodies as well. Also, white women did rape people, and they also they did rape black people, women and men. So we cannot just put that on white men. There were white women raping black bodies as well, and some of them being pregnant by black men as well.
I want to come in with some questions from our viewers. There was in your earlier comments that that this woman lent money to a free Black woman. Could you maybe expound on that a little? Was she known to do that regularly? Was this an isolated incident, or was she known to assist Black women
Right.
monetarily?
Well, we only know that she loaned money to this Black woman because of the court records, because she sues this Black woman later on. In New Orleans had the largest population of free people of color in the South. At the time of the Civil War, there was over 10,000 free people of color. Everyone in New Orleans knew free people of color, white people as well as enslaved Africans. So they would have interacted with them all the time. Also, this free Black woman could have been a relative of Marie Delphine LaLaurie. As noted, her father had Black children as well as her uncles. So this person could have been a relative of Delphine Marie LaLaurie, who was on bad terms, or let's say the woman was, a lot of Black women were washerwomen or market women. And let's say this Black woman got sick and she couldn't go to work at the market, but she got to pay her rent or her mortgage. So Madame was like, look, you my relative, I'm going to give you a little money to hold you over until you get better. So it could have been something as simple as that, where this woman, because back in those days, if you didn't physically work, you didn't earn any money. And she could have been aiding a relative, or she could have been helping one of our old Africans that she set free, one of their relatives. So it had to be some type of familiar connection on why she loaned the Black woman money.
Well, we also have this question, and then I'm going to let Sister Khara pick back up on our questions. Would you make a correlation between some white women then and white women now?
White women hiding behind the guise of social acceptance. I think there's a direct correlation between white women then and white women now. When a white woman at work cries, that's violence. If you notice, all throughout history, when you think about Emmett Till, that was white woman violence. When you think about the sister that called the police on that Black man who was jogging in Central Park, saying, "Oh, a Black man is coming," that was violence. So there is a level of violence or a position of violence that white women have always held, that they use when it was advantageous to them. A couple of years ago, when I believe I was in college, there was a white woman who said that a Black man carjacked her children or carjacked her, and it turned out it wasn't. So it's incidents like that when it comes down to perception and reality, and also how some people do not deem white women as violent. This goes back into how they would police people. And if you don't perceive a person that they don't have the aptitude to be violent, you're just believe that you need to arrest them or hold them responsible.
Thank you.
Oh no,
Thank you.
I want to go back to that question of the perceptions. And one of the things that I find it interesting, because before the broadcast started, we were having a conversation about some of the events that just happened in Georgia, and the presentation of the man who murdered those folks, as trying to come up with rationales behind his acts of violence and the hate crimes that were perpetrated, from referring to him as potentially mentally ill, to saying that he may have had a sexual disorder, and all of these things to kind of rationalize that behavior. One of the things that I find so interesting with Madame Laurie's story is that same sort of attempts to not validate what she did, but almost exonerate her from what she did. There are conversations where folks were trying to say that she was driven insane by the murder of an uncle, by slaves, by her husband, or perhaps multiple of her husbands. And so using that as an excuse for for what she did. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that attempt to exonerate her from what she did, and where we start to see the reality of what happened. You know, there's not the question of the bodies of the enslaved Africans that were found. There's not a question of whether or not they were murdered. She is recognized as a serial killer. But the question really comes down to why she did it and whether or not there is a rationalization of what she did. So if you can speak to that a little bit.
Right. I do think there is trying to humanize her when you don't want to humanize the Africans. You don't want to humanize because it's so ironic that nobody took their stories, nobody got their last accounts, nobody talked in depth to the cook that was chained to the stove. Like, where was their written reports of their last words of what happened to them and what you know what I'm saying? So it was very, very, even with how they handled the situation, like how was this person allowed to get away? Why was she allowed to stay at her house? Why was her carriage allowed to still? There's so many questions on them trying to give leeway or humanize it. Also, the privileges of her being rich, connected. One of Madame. Oh, stop. Okay, Paul. See, I did it. See, and that's the problem. The problem is I almost call her I hate. So in common language, she's called Madame Lorry. I do not call her Madame because she's a beast. So normally I call her the beast Lorry. But there's so many people who, even in historical texts, she's still going to respect. Yet we do not respect the Africans who she murdered. So I do think there are little things like a name is trying to give her credence and try to figure out, well, why did this socialite white lady? Oh no, she couldn't do that. But no, the evidence that is here is saying that she is a serial killer, that she has some extreme mental disorders, and that she deserved to be punished. And I'm very upset that she was not punished. Unless she was run down by that board.
Give me one moment.
Oh, no problem.
Can I come in with a question?
Yes, you may.
Can we talk a little bit about give us an idea of what the household was like when we have a European American male who has the traditional marriage to the European American woman, but also has the Black and or African wife or mistress. Can you give us a picture of what that household was possibly like? How chaotic was it, or how acceptable was it?
What in New Orleans, they would not be under the same household because only a fool would do that. So most times these Frenchmen or even these Creole men or even the men, the American white men started doing, because it became a culturally accepted practice. So the practice was two things. One, you did not entertain an enslaved Black woman. You freed her. If you was really about that life, you freed her. And then you gave her at least the house.
Okay.
So they would have their own household. Also, there were some white men who never got married to white women. They clearly had a romantic and interest with this one. Like, there were some white men who was like, if I could marry her, this is the person I would be with. So there were some white men who did not get married to white women at all in Louisiana. And there's some white men who kept, and even to this day, still keep black. Like like in Louisiana, we have old families who people know that hey, this person, like there's a black side of family, there's a white family. So and they have the same last name. So yeah, it was just a culturally accepted thing that progressed even to the 1800s with the domestic slave trade. Where the title for some of these women was fancy women, or selling these women down south. So it was just a very unique, strange thing. So yeah, but it was accepted. And they developed their own independent household of how their household would run.
Right. And I think just one last question for me. Ken, how versed are you on Black women in in New Orleans, and their hair? We did a segment a few months back, one of our earlier segments, where we kind of touched on how Black women, African women, began to wrap their heads, to cover their heads in these very ornate um, uh, head wraps. Could you share a little bit about that with
Well,
us?
do you remember who did the presentation? Was it somebody from New Orleans?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. I think actually I remember doing something on hair. I presented
Okay.
something on hair, and being from here, growing up here in Savannah, Georgia, which shares sort of a lot of similarity
Right.
in slave history with our sister city, New Orleans. So we're familiar with those head wraps and why we
Right.
began to cover, or were ordered to cover our heads.
So this is the interesting fact about that is that Marie Delphine McCarthy, I her father's sister was married to Governor Miro, and Governor Miro is the governor who is going to uh, make an edict in the 1700s that declared that black women, whether they be enslaved or free, when they came out in public, that their head had to be wrapped with a handkerchief or cloth. These black women were this law become known as the Taillon law, and that's what they called it, a Taillon. Is almost very similar to African Nigerian gile. These
Mhm.
African women, however, because black women, black people creative, they went and bought fancy fabric and they went and got cloth and they wrapped them heads up into different styles and competed with one another, and they put on those big earrings, and it literally became a fashion crave. Like people all over wanted to wear these head wraps. So there's so black women actually in Delphine time would have, when they went out in public, they would always have their own Taillon. That's why in every picture of Marie Laveau, the Queen, which I want to thank Madame Marie Laveau, because her energy was very, very supportive in this research. She was like, "Yeah, Malik, she a witch." So I was like, "I'm gonna call Royal Street Witches Walk," and she was like, "Yeah, that's right. That's who she is." So you never see Marie Laveau without her Taillon. And
Mhm.
because during her era, when she was a child, that's what she had to wear on when she got in public. So she got to be an old woman. She always had it on. The Taillon laws is very, very important. And even when the Americans came down, they noted um, how colorful the women of color was, that they would wear all type of colors and stuff. And actually, part of the law that's not mentioned is the governor told the black women not to ornate themselves or wear bright colors,
Right.
because they were being the competition of white women, and the white women got increasingly upset that the men were eyes was wandering to the black women.
If I may, I'd like to use that to kind of take us down a little bit of a thread in this conversation, because I find that really interesting that that law was put in place because of the perceived threat of the Black woman's appearance. whether her hair was appealing, the colors she was wearing were appealing, all of these sorts of things to control that bodily representation or freedom. One of the
And
interesting
this house. And also I
yes.
want to add that these free women of color were extreme businesswomen, real
Mm,
estate investors, they own businesses, they were market women. That was also a threat that these women understood the importance of self-independence, that even if they were connected to a free man of color or white man, they understood that they had to do for self. And that passed down through the generations of women of color and black women understanding that they had to, God bless a child that had his own. And these black women were extremely successful business women. A lot of people don't know that the first black coffee vendor in New Orleans was a black woman, a slave woman named Rose Nicole, and she made enough money to buy herself and also to buy property in the like. And when I say property, I'm talking about prime property to sell her coffee in the French Quarter. So white women was also very jealous of their entrepreneurial spirit as well.
Yeah. One of the things that you referenced during your presentation was the enslaved Africans having rights in New Orleans. And I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on what those rights look like. Were they freedom within society, or was it freedom with limits, or what did that exactly look like?
Well, what Europeans put down on paper is different than what they do in action. So even though it was written down on paper, it was written down that there was that especially during the beginning of colonial periods, they did not want individuals or masters to punish the Africans. This is not really for the Africans' well-being. This is because the Africans are being bought on loan and they don't want you harming and mutilating property that if you don't pay off, the state has to sell. Also, it states that you have to feed your Africans, you have to shelter them, etc. However, we know that Africans were locked up normally in colonial Louisiana because most places were surrounded by swamp, and Africans can run away into the swamp and get away and develop maroon colonies. Or a lot of times we know conditions of Africans through court records. So when they asked Africans, why did you run away? These Africans grew rice, but they were not allowed to eat the rice. So they were starving. So you see these conditions that even though in paper it says that you have to feed them, you have to clothe them, you have to shelter them, that certain people did not decide to do that. There's an article that just came out of Frederick Douglass, how he said in slavery, food was used as a weapon. Meaning, I'm going to starve you to the point of you going to want this little scrap. You know what I'm saying? Also, the most impactful law in the Code Noir, though, however, is that on Sundays, the Africans were given a free day. Now, of course, all throughout slavery, you heard that, church and Africans off on Sundays. But in the French cultural context, the French love to dance. They love opera. They love partying. So in the French cultural mores, in their brain, they really thought on Sundays, the Africans can do whatever they wanted to do. So they literally gave the Africans free range, and the Africans develop. I'm not going to get too much of my tour because when y'all come to New Orleans, I want y'all to take a NOLA tour. But the Africans literally go to a special spot in New Orleans and they maintain African culture and traditions. So when you see second line, when you see jazz, all of that are remnants of African traditions in the city of New Orleans because the Africans took that power of having that free day and they utilized it in their own way. So these are some of the things that in the Code Noir that gives them now. Oh, also when the Spanish come, the Spanish adds on a law saying that if you give your master your market value price, you can buy your freedom whether he like it or not. So Africans in Louisiana, New Orleans are literally saving up to buy themselves, and the number of free people of color doubles underneath the Spanish administration than underneath the French. So these Africans are using enterprise now to buy themselves. So these are some examples of how the Code Noir in some ways develop I'm gonna say that they wasn't being beneficent, but it made loopholes that the Africans learn how to utilize to better make a society that was more equipped that they can leave something behind. So these loopholes, they use these loopholes in the Cold War to build certain things and certain fabrics and put it into society. So yeah.
Yeah. I want to go back to, you talked about the two enslaved Africans that Delphine went to the courts to petition for their freedom. And there are some who have tried to use those as uh, those efforts on her part as presentations of, you know, she didn't really have a problem with Black people. She was just killing people because of killing people. They just happened to be Africans. But if you look at some of the, I'm hoping that you can give us a little bit more of the context behind both of those cases, because you shared with the first person that it was actually more likely that her husband had willed that that would happen. And part of what I've read with the second um, uh, court petition to give the enslaved African their freedom was that it was actually probably more in line with local law at the time, that if an enslaved person was well behaved and at a certain age, it was sort of social practice to give them their freedom then as sort of a reward for having been a good slave for how long or however long that they were. So can
Right.
you speak to that a little bit more?
Well, I think you covered the first one very well. That the first one was her executing the wishes of her deceased husband and making sure that his last known wishes was done, and making sure that the word he kept to the African was kept. So I think that first one was definitely about her husband and keeping her word to help. The last one is a little more complicated because there's really no. I mean, she, of course, in the court document, she talks about how this is a good slave or enslaved person, how they're honest and etc. Yada yada yada. But those are common languages in emancipation requests. Truthfully, there is a story there, and that story is maybe something happened where that person did something where Delphine was like, "Look, you earned it." You know what I'm saying? And it wasn't nothing else. Like I remember there was a situation where there was a man who rescued a white woman in New Orleans from an unpleasant situation, and because of that, she bought a school building and gave it to the free people of color. So for her to, because those are the only two court petitions that we see of her freeing two Africans. Mind you, she had owned over 20 African people.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the only two. So it goes one that she wasn't freeing Black people on the regular. She wasn't freeing the old people. She wasn't freeing people. But there was something about this. I believe it was a woman.
Okay.
Also, maybe this woman was a gift from a family member. And maybe they were just like, look, after so while, please free her. So it may have been another request from a family member for this young woman or this young person, because her age, I think, is in her 30s or 40s, so she's relatively young.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about, um, you know, we've gone back to the issue of the white men in New Orleans who had more than one family, and you referenced the fact that, you know, you'd have to be outside of your right frame of mind to have both wives in the same household.
Right.
But I want to hear if you can talk a little bit more about the um, the cultural dynamic that that created, that it would have created within those households. How did that uh, move the relationship between the blacks and whites in that society, the freed whites and the enslaved blacks in particular? but also just how it impacted the relationships of white women to Black women in that society, with them perhaps seeing that second family as direct competition or having infringed on their. Was there any sort of sense of that? That sense of betrayal on the part of the husband and anger towards the Black family, or what did that really look like?
I don't think there's any really physical writings or documentations of white women expressing um feelings about cultural traditions, particularly about the dynamics of having multiple families. Throughout their actions, though, whether it be requesting, because the Governor Miro passing that law did not come from him. It came as a document that the white women of the colony asked him to do that. There's a New Orleans historian, Madame Barbara Trevine, who is an expert in the Taillon. She's also an expert in free people of color. She comes from a long family of free people of color from New Orleans. She has documented that the whole mythology behind octoroon balls and free women of color selling their daughters to rich white men is actually um, it's a smear campaign against free Black women.
Mm.
So there was definitely attempts in the colony to frame Black women and Black femininity in one light, when literally the Black women probably of the era had to be the most highest, hardworking women in the colony, because they had no backdrop. You know what I'm saying? They had to ensure that they and their children got what they needed to get in order to build a better life. So you do see, in kind of in hindsight, activities of attack or smear campaigns against Black women by white women, and that's definitely had to come from a place of maybe jealousy, a place of insecurity, but also you may have had some white women who didn't like men and was probably like, "Good, you gonna see her? I don't want you in the house no way. I don't like you. Like, go, because I'm gonna have my little fling over here." So, you never know in every household what was the situation between the dynamic. But you also have not, and you do have some places in Louisiana and New Orleans, definitely in plantation economy, where, like, let's say you have 12 years a slave, where the white woman she knows that about her husband activities or infidelities, and she take that violence out on either Black bodies or the Black women who he is sexually assaulting.
Mm.
And you see that in 12 Years a Slave, and that's actual written account by Solomon Northam, how his white mistress made him beat this Black woman because she was being sexually assaulted by her husband.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to talk more about the emotions, because you just referenced that of some of the different things that folks may have been feeling that led to some of the behavior. And one of the things that really stood out to me, one of the things that you referenced was that 1811 slave revolt that was the largest in the country. And I'm not sure if it was the largest in history or just the largest in that time period, but what I found so interesting in that account is the story of not only the orchestration of the revolt on the part of the enslaved Africans who organized. It was some like 500 strong who organized themselves um, in order to fight for their freedom. But what I find really interesting is the response and what happened as a result of it, with um, the telling of, in order to discourage that sort of revolt in the future, the beheading then of hundreds or 100 or more of the Africans, and lining them along the road on pikes. There's a story in New Orleans of that. There are stories in the South, in other areas of the South, of that same sort of really inhumane and just haunting images that folks would have to then walk by. So if you can talk a little bit more about that sort of a response and the what I think is safe to assume was the fear that existed within that society that would lead to that sort of inhumanity and that sort of exaggerated response.
You mean in the South in the 1811?
Yes.
Honestly, I think it's the same type of society, the same type of fear, in watching a black man be choked all over the internet and the TV.
Mm-hmm.
I think white supremacy cannot survive without sacrifices, and black bodies, but too often have been their sacrifices. All throughout the Jim Crow South, you have the African term, you getting out of your place, know your place. So literally, when you have a small regulation of freedom, white supremacy told black people, you have a certain place that you need to stay in, and they literally maim and kill as an example to other people. I mean, if you look at Ida B. Wells' research and her documentation, most of those black people in Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, these are business owners. These are entrepreneurs. When you look at Rosewood or Tulsa, Oklahoma. So these are not black people committing violence against white people. These are black people prospering and doing things to help themselves. So even with most of this activity came out of the election of Barack Obama, whether it be searching for freedom in 1811 or the election of the first black president. The response of white supremacy is the same, and that is to make examples to show black people, hey, y'all need to get back into that place that we told y'all belong. So I think it's the same type of society. I think it's the same type of actions. The actions are now being done by the police. And it makes the same type of fear. It doesn't mean black mothers, black people, they're terrified when the police pulled them over. They're terrified that they don't know if their family member is gonna come home. And then not just for black men now, black women, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland. So even when black people get in certain situations, if we have to question, do I call the police for this situation? That is fair. Like, we can't automatically say, oh, let me call 911. We be like, hold up, does this event call for me calling the police? And if I do call the police, will the police make it better? And will we all wind up alive? So these are questions that black people are asking in 2021 that I'm sure they was trying to answer in 1811 when somebody was like, yo, we need to get together and handle the situation. So yeah, I think there is similarities in trying to instill fear and in trying to make a society that you think is making America good again. I think that's a good combination of past and present.
Yeah.
We're getting another question, maybe to go back and add some more clarity on the laws that were created to prohibit the killing of these enslaved peoples by white women. Can you take us back to that again?
Okay, so in 1724, the Code Noir, Codenior, are black codes, which were taken from the Caribbean. So this is the edict used to control black lives in colonial Louisiana and also in Haiti as well. Now, the Louisiana code is going to slightly differ because they're going to change certain things about the code, but it's equivalent of the same code. So the Code Noir is, I think, 64 edicts. They're going to go in and change it towards the end, and then the Spaniards are going to come in and they're going to change and add some more laws as well. So these are just edicts and laws that are going to say, what black people can and cannot do. Like, one of the laws is stating that all black people in Louisiana must be baptized into Catholicism. So every enslaved African who came into Louisiana had to be baptized into Catholicism because Catholicism was the state religion. There was no religion. So that's why New Orleans and Louisiana have the largest number of Black Catholics in America today, because all Black people in colonial times were baptized into Catholicism. So these are, and it's so funny how these laws that happened in 1724 still have cultural reach all the way into 2021.
And so, Brother Malik, we do this to have the very difficult conversations. And so I have an obligation to put it out there. So here we are in here we are today. All of these incidents. And so now we have this, the Karens and the Beckys.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that as what we're talking about? Women who had privilege, money, power, real estate, human property, thriving businesses. And so, I think we would all agree that it's quite possible that some of these Karens and Beckys are descendants of some of these madams. Do we agree with that, or is that this story that we're covering this evening, this historical piece, is this the beginnings of the Karen and the Beckys? Were these the Karen and the Beckys of that day?
No, it's hard to reach if it was the Karen and the Beckys of their day, because I don't even think this is the beginning of white women and their violence to Black people. Like Lorry, there was way more white women committing violence against Black people and Black bodies. It may not have been discovered, it may not have been documented. And I think as it pertains to today, I think the young ones and the young kids and young people, as they march, as they protest, as they talk about dismantling the police, as they talk about dismantling systems of oppression, as they talking about dismantling patriarchy, as they talk about, they are so radical and so unapologetic about being pro-Black, pro-woman, and just tearing down those systems that needs to be tore down, because honestly, we are still operating in the systems that produce Delphine LaLaurie. So, and now these young people are demanding change and equity, not just equality, but equity. And that's what is making, that's what's making a change today. And that's what putting the Beckys and Karens on Front Street to look at themselves and see what changes they need to make in joining us and pulling down the systems of oppression. And if they don't want to join us, they can go with the system.
So are the Becky and Karens the 2.0 version of well, we don't want to call her Madame.
Yeah.
But so, is what we're seeing now, is this the 2.0 version then?
It's a form of a version. It's a form because it's always morphing into a new reality to meet the times. But anyway, the white women who voted for Donald Trump, they're committing violence. The white women who call the police on little Black children, they're committing violence. And we have to hold them responsible for their, well, I don't know. Somebody got to hold them responsible for their actions, unlike what they did with Lorry, the witch Lorry.
I think that's a really interesting point that you make, because it was something that that you referenced earlier, was the when we were talking about the moves to kind of exonerate her for her actions. And you reference the fact that, we don't want to call her Madame because that's giving her that elevated status. It's sort of
Right.
making her this hero, and she has become the sort of mythological figure. So if we can look at that and just the danger of creating a hero of a figure like this who perpetuated that sort of violence and white supremacist action, and compare that maybe to what where I think it's part of the original title of the presentation was talking about her as a Southern belle and giving that representation as, the historical white woman on a pedestal. And today, when we have the representation of um, I always find it very hard to refer to the Karen because I have a very good friend who is a European American woman, and her name is Karen, and she is not that stereotype. But that image of white womanhood, not European American womanhood, but white supremacist womanhood, as this noble figure who is victimized, despite the fact that they are victimizing people of color. So if we can talk about just the dangers of that sort of heroicizing of Delphine LaLaurie and how that relates to what we see now.
Right. We just got to constantly tell our own stories. We have to center our own narratives. That's what I do with No Nola Tours, which give African heritage tours in New Orleans, which telling the stories of our stories, but also telling the stories of our ancestors. It is very disheartening to tell people to say we don't need any more slave stories. Because do you know your great grandmother's story? Do you know your great grandfather's story? Do you know what they really went through? So how can you say you don't want to hear any more stories when you don't even know your own story? So we have to constantly tell their stories. A bar mitzvah and a bis mitzvah is just saying that we won't forget the story. What is the story? Remember your God that took you out of Egypt. That happens thousands of years ago, and they still talking about their story. So what is wrong with reminding America this is what you did to us, and we want our check? And not the $1,400 check neither. We want the big check. We want our student loans paid. So we have to, but in order to demand, you have to know the details, you have to know the facts, you have to know the stories, you have to know the situations, and you can demand, you can reclaim your power from a place of power. So we have to, and that's what's going on in New Orleans right now. New Orleans, not only do they take down all of the Confederate monuments in New Orleans, but they're also renaming all streets that are named after known white supremacists or Confederate generals. So New Orleans is systematically going through all of their streets and seeing who promoted and supported white supremacist ideals, so their names can be removed from honoring them on our street corners. So things like that is what we need to do, and including with the story of the witch Lorry. That's the new title that got founded here on this podcast, about the witch Lorry, and not framing her as this aristocratic, rich white woman who just so happened knows she was a horrific person who did horrendous things. She did acts against humanity, and she needs to be charged, indicted, and found guilty of her role in brutalizing against humanity. So we need to hold her responsible for that. And if you can't hold her responsible in life, we need to hold her responsible in debt.
All right. We are at the end of this presentation. So I want to say absolutely thank you so much for the history, for the information, for the context, for helping to frame this discussion and giving us all of this insight into this particular story and how it relates to the narrative that we're engaging in today. Part of the work of the Live Black Experience project has been telling these stories and having these difficult conversations because of that very work of the accountability, the reckoning that's been happening in our country for not just the past year since the events of 2020, but really for a very long time that we've been dealing with and coming to terms with and confronting. And part of, I think, the message that we take away from this conversation is the fact that it's not enough to tell these stories and not be willing to grapple with those difficult facts, but to actually do the reckoning work and not allow ourselves to get distracted by the discomfort of those who don't want to confront these historical truths of some of the background of this country. So
and not letting those people go, hold those people responsible, hold those people. We need to, even after the trials, we need to hold those police officers responsible for the killings of Sister Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor. And we need to be holding these people who are harming Black people and Black women. We need to hold these people and Black men. We need to hold them responsible. Why we holding people responsible? Get that woman who 90 years old who lied on Emmett Till, they all can go to jail, So we need to be holding these people responsible for their present and past actions that are harmful to Black bodies and Black people, and set the example that we would not be allowing people to harm us physically, emotionally, mentally, and psychologically.
Amen. We want to thank, as always, our audience who joined us this evening. We have folks who join us from not only Flagstaff, but throughout Arizona, throughout the country. We have viewers in the U.S. Virgin Islands, in Mexico, and in other places around the world who are joining and tuning in to these important conversations. Unfortunately, because I had to switch over from my computer to being on my phone, I can't pull up the slides that we usually show at the end of these presentations. But I do want to remind folks that our next session coming up is on Sunday, March 21st at 2 p.m. Arizona time. And it will be on white supremacy's cornerstone, discussing the March 21st, 1891 cornerstone speech given by Alexander Hamilton Stevens, Vice President of the Confederate States of America. So we will be discussing that with Dr. Frederick Gooding, who will be rejoining us to dive into that conversation. Ms. Bernadine, did you want to close us out, or?
I can. I just got excited. The cornerstone speech was made right here in Savannah, and I was downtown today, right at the very spot where that speech was made. So really looking forward to that presentation. But this presentation this evening, very enlightening, right on point. And thank you, Sister Khara, for setting the record straight. All Karens and Beckys are not like this new stereotype that unfortunately we seem to be seeing and experiencing in this current day and time. And so it brings us, oh, Brother Malik.
Oh, no, I can wait. I was just going to say thank you.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Say thank you.
No, I just want to say thank you to Ms. House and Ms. Lewis. Thank y'all so much. Black women, of course, just like in New Orleans, in colonial times, y'all leading the charge and looking good while doing it. And I'm definitely I want to hear the speech. So I'm gonna be following the page because I love history and I'm excited about what you all are doing. And anytime you would like to, you can learn any more about New Orleans history or anything dealing with New Orleans and Creole history, please feel free to call on me. But I just want to say thank y'all so much for taking the time out of what y'all do every day to present to the masses about subjects on Black history, and that is so important. So thank you.
Well, we thank you for being here. We thank our viewers, and being in this time zone really makes me appreciate all the more our viewers who view in from other time zones, from other parts of the country. It's very humbling. I'm looking at the time. It's 10:37 and
Cool.
over here, and so to know that um, people tune in this time of the night and later to hear what we're doing. We say thank you to all of our LBE community and to our presenters who make the time, such as Brother Malik, who's with us this evening. And I'm going to put it out there as we close. I think um, I'd like to see the LBE project maybe do an actual trial where we actually argue the case and put this woman on trial.
Oh, wow.
So I think that would make for an interesting broadcast to see what a trial, what a jury of her peers would say about this case, about these charges. With that, we say thank you. We do not do these to insult or to belittle, but to shed light on a very ugly past. It is what it is, but we need to know um, the history, and this history that most would say, well, that's Black history or that's a slave history. It is all of that, but at the end of the day, it is America's history. And this is why we do what we do. And so we say thank you for joining us. Please come back and see us on the 21st when we talk about the Cornerstone speech. Thank you and have a good evening. Go in grace.